Attention, you're listening to the Todd Huff Radio Show, America's home for conservative, not bitter talk radio. Be advised that the content of this program has been documented to prevent and even cure liberalism, and listening may cause you to lean to the right. Here's your conservative, but not bitter host, Todd Huff.
Well, that is right, my friends. You've tuned in to America's home for conservative, not bitter talk. I am celebrating late last night a Pacers victory. For those of you who watched the NBA playoffs, Pacers now up 3-1. Far from over, but look, one game away from a very chippy and entertaining series. My type of basketball. I have loved this. Also, I've enjoyed, didn't think I would ever say this, the Pistons and Knicks series, which has also been equally chippy. Anyway, my friends, it is good to be here. Thank you for joining us today. A couple things I want to go through today. First, well, I don't know the order yet. Sometimes I make game time decisions here on the program, and I'm going to do that probably today as well. But here's what we've got in the stack of stuff. I was asked yesterday about what we do with some of these judges who have been making rulings against the Trump administration. Now, that's a blanket statement, but I want to talk about that. I want to talk about how I think about this. I want to talk about what I think should be done. And we're going to do that in this program. We've also got the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act, which the left is, of course, making this into be something that it's not, talking about looking and examining. Cover young ears, my friends, if you've got those nearby. 3, 2, 1. The left fixated on talking about having people examine what's in young girls. I don't even feel comfortable saying it, my friends. What's in their underwear is what the left says. So we've got that out there. We've got Kristi Noem. Her purse was stolen, which became a mockery from the left. And now we know who stole the purse. There's an alarming survey from the deep state that's out there, which I talked about in today's Todd Talk. My friends, regardless, we got plenty to get to. So if you want to be part of the conversation, I invite you. Email Todd at toddhuffshow.com or text 317-210-2830. Before we hit the road running here today, my friends, let me ask you, are you a lover of seafood? Are you someone who enjoys high-quality, fresh, and I mean fresh seafood? Well, if that is you, consider checking out the seafood offered by our friends at Kenai Fish. Kenai Fish delivers to you, no matter where you are in this country, fresh, wild-caught Alaskan seafood from the Kenai and Castleoff rivers in Alaska. Also from the Gulf of Alaska, which should not be confused with the Gulf of America. We've got sockeye, coho, and king salmon. They've got halibut. They've got king crab, snow crab, scallops, a whole lot more. This is all harvested freshly. It is put into vacuum-sealed packages, and it is shipped to you wherever you are next day air. My friends, it is a seafood lover's dream, and once you have a bite of this, I think you'll be hooked. Yes, pun is fully intended. Website, KenaiFish.com. That's Kenai Fish, KenaiFish.com. Promo code Todd, by the way, saves you 15% on your purchase. KenaiFish.com, KenaiFish.com. Promo code Todd. All right, let's get to it today, my friends. Let's start here with these the judges. So I was out yesterday, and someone came up to me, and we were chatting, and I was asked, what are we going to do about all of these judges who have been interfering in what Trump is trying to do? Now, let me pause and let me clarify this, because there are people from all over the political spectrum who might have heard me utter those words who think, well, wait a minute, Todd, that's a perfectly legitimate thing for a court to do. Now, I would say it depends, because there are clear rules for what's necessary to have standing. There's legal processes and precedent. There are federal statutes, not statues, as Kramer from Seinfeld thought these were statues. These are statutes, and of course the Constitution. And the words mean things, right? And let's pause there for just a moment, because listen, the founders framed the judiciary to not be a political entity. Now, that's not ever going to be 100% possible, because people are political and people are on the judicial, in the judiciary, running the courts. And so it's not completely possible, but they didn't want federal judges to be elected, Supreme Court justices to be elected. These were to be nominated by the president. These were to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. That's how we get on the Supreme Court. And even in some of the federal courts, that's how this process works. And the reason is that the founders wanted a group of people who were unbiased, and it's one of the reasons why someone has, on the Supreme Court, for example, a lifetime appointment. They don't want someone making decisions on the Supreme Court. They didn't. The founders they didn't want someone on the Supreme Court making a decision that was politically the will of the people, because that's not who the Supreme Court represents. The Supreme Court represents the statutes and the Constitution of the United States. That's if you want to think of it this way, the spokesperson, or the group responsible for representing or speaking for the laws on the books and the Constitution. That is their job. That's who they're speaking up for. And that should not be subject to the whim of the political will of the people. So if you think about it, when the laws were passed, when the Constitution was ratified, those things were subject to a political process. But now that once those have been implemented into law, now it's the job of someone who steps outside as much as possible of the political fray to interpret it, even if it is incredibly unpopular, even if it is something that the people don't want. If the judge says, look, this is what the law says, you can change the law, you can do something about it, but I'm not going to tell you it says something it doesn't just because I politically want it to say something different, or even you want it to say something politically different. You have processes whereby you can try to remedy this, no matter what it is. Now, if it's an amendment, there's one of the amendments to the Constitution, you've got a higher standard, a higher bar to exceed. But if it is in general federal statute, either way, you've got a recourse whereby the political process can remedy what the court says. The court should be saying what the documents are what the founding document tries to explain, articulate, the position it's trying to, the rule, or the process that's being laid out by the founding document. This is what the court is trying to stand up for in an ideal world. Now, if you've listened to this program for any time, you would have heard me talk about judicial activism. What is judicial activism? Well, I'm glad you asked. Judicial activism is when someone on the court is in a position just like I described, but when they come across a law they don't like, or they come across an amendment they don't like, they simply say that it means something else, which is a big problem, because now suddenly we either have the person on the court saying something that they personally want. They're no longer being the representative, if you will, for the Constitution or for the statutes on the books, and now they're being a spokesperson for themselves, or for a small group of people, or for a majority of people. It doesn't matter. That's not their role. Their role is to interpret and apply the law as it should be applied in cases where there is standing and so forth. This gets a little complicated and convoluted because, again, you go back to, say, the lawfare that was waged against President Trump, or even, probably a better example would be going back to the court cases the Trump administration had, the cases they had filed. A lot of judges, in general, the judgment was you don't have jurisdiction here. There's no standing. This is not something that you can even bring to the court. And so when people talk as though the court heard all the evidence about election interference and said that's made up silly nonsense, get out of town, that's not what happened. They didn't even hear it. They would say you don't have standing. This is not something that you can bring to this court. This is outside of our jurisdiction because you can't bring it and we can't rule on it, all that sort of stuff. So, assuming those things come into play, assuming that there is standing and the court has jurisdiction and can make a blanket ruling and so forth. I've heard this discussed a lot lately. If this is, if there are cases that apply across the country or that apply to a variety or multiple individuals, then it becomes a class action lawsuit. It becomes complicated. And the average person, we don't live in this world. So we're keeping it to the generalities. The court should be interpreting the Constitution and the federal statutes at hand. They should not be inserting themselves, their political preferences. That's why it truly shouldn't matter. It truly shouldn't matter what the political preferences are of the person on the bench. Now, it does in reality. It matters tremendously. But in a perfect world, it wouldn't matter because someone would say, I set those personal opinions aside and I read the text, I look at the case, I figure out how the law applies, and I make my ruling strictly upon that. In fact, I think you heard it during I think it was Kavanaugh's confirmation process. Kavanaugh said, I think it was Kavanaugh, if there's not a case, if there's not a judgment that you make that you don't disagree with, then you're not doing your job. That's a pretty good standard because if you don't agree personally with how you ruled, but you did it because that's what the law said, then you are doing your job. It's just like a journalist. We shouldn't know what a true journalist's personal opinions are. We've lost this in this country, by the way. I've been through this last week, everybody wants to be an editorialist, an opinion writer. They want to influence the way that people think about issues instead of just giving us the information and letting us decipher it on our own, come to our own conclusions based upon the full amount of evidence available at a given time. That's not the way that it works, but that's the way that it's supposed to work. And so there should be pressure both in making sure journalists are actually journalists and in making sure judges are actually judges. Now we get to the political part of this process. Because if a judge starts making rulings that, look, you ought to be able to defend your ruling. And there is a point at which your ruling becomes indefensible to someone who's truly objective and, looking to understand something logically and coherently. There's a point at which it is completely indefensible. And in some cases, a judge might venture into that territory. Now, when they do, they're not immune from the Congress actually saying we're going to impeach this particular judge. They are abusing their power. Look, every branch has the ability to have oversight to some degree on the other. This is what separate co-equal branches of government mean. The president doesn't work for Congress. The Congress doesn't work for the president. The Supreme Court doesn't work for Congress. The president doesn't work for the Supreme Court, but they have certain instances where they have precedent or they have kind of an oversight or the ability to overrule the other branch. For example, Congress can send a law to the president can veto it. But that doesn't mean Congress is done. Congress can come up with a supermajority and override the president's veto, saying there's enough of us that want this law to pass. Now it's going to become law no matter if you veto it or not. Likewise, the president can appoint a Supreme Court justice. Specifically, the Senate here can say we're not going to confirm that justice. We don't think this nominee has the aptitude or the attitude, the mentality to be a fair-minded Supreme Court justice. And so they can say we're going to deny this appointment. Once a Supreme Court justice gets onto the court, they can rule. They can rule, again, notwithstanding some of the things we've mentioned here today. They can say a law passed by Congress is unconstitutional or it violates other existing federal statutes or whatever, and that's how this works. But in no way should a judge be out there pushing for conservatism or liberalism or anything else from the bench. They should be applying the law as written, applying the Constitution as written. And if we find that they're not doing their job, look, there are cases where it's a difficult thing, and we understand that there's interpretation and justices disagree. I mean, there's 5-4 votes in the Supreme Court. They're not all 9-0 one way or the other. Some of them are 5-4. Some of them have very strongly written dissenting opinions. There was one just written recently regarding the federal, the role of the bureaucracy to interfere with Trump implementing his agenda, or the role of the courts implementing or blocking Trump's agenda. So there's all this going on. And at our core, we know, look, the judges have a role. The judiciary has a role in our government. But that doesn't mean that they have any rule that they want. They can't just simply stop anything that they personally disagree with. And now we're getting closer to the issue. Now, just because something is politically, maybe a little bit politically divisive, there's two sides to it. It may be a 50-50 split. If the law is clear, the court doesn't have the right to stop something that the Trump administration is doing simply because they don't like it. Now, they don't typically come out and just say, I don't like this. What are you going to do about it? That will likely be overruled by a higher court. But in having these opinions that are not rooted in the law or rooted in good reason and sense, then these things become easily overturned by a higher court, and it becomes obvious to the people that this particular judge is a problem because he's not doing his job. Now, if that's the case, 100% the judge can be impeached. Now, but how does that work? Well, you've got to go through the impeachment process of Congress, right? So there's got to be articles of impeachment introduced. There's a vote. Then it goes to the Senate for someone to be removed. This is not an easy process, especially when you have very, very small majorities for Republicans in Congress, both in the House and in the Senate. How are you going to get these things done? And so my first answer to someone who says, what do you do about these rogue judges? I'm not saying do this to a judge who offers an opinion that maybe is different from ours, but we can see the logic in it. You just don't want to start taking every judge down the impeachment route. But if a judge is abusing his or her authority, if a judge is not interpreting the law and the Constitution, if their opinion makes no sense, I remember talking about it on this program with you. Stephen Breyer, former Supreme Court Justice of the United States, he had at one point stated that you can cite foreign law in your opinions, which is crazy to me. What in the world does that mean? The guy's just making things up as he goes. I remember saying on this program, and I've said it from time to time since then, we're a half step away of being able to cite Harry Potter novels. Not that there's anything right or wrong with Harry Potter. I'm just saying what says that we can't cite anything. The way I felt in the morning, what I had for breakfast. No, you have a specific job that requires you to articulate the reason, the rationale, the legal precedent, the constitutional limits, and so forth for your decision. And if you're not doing that, you should absolutely, regardless of your political affiliation, be subject to impeachment. So that's the first thing that we should be doing. And I don't care. I don't care if there's going to be enough votes or not. I've got a practical side, but I've also got a side that says we need to hold these folks accountable. We need to make them defend this stuff. Make those who are going to allow judges to act like this to defend these things. Now, I got a couple of examples here. I've got a summary here. Immigration, here's some places where judicial interference has potentially been the case with the implementation of Trump's agenda. So, the Venezuela deportations block, the court temporarily blocked the removal of Venezuelan nationals under the Alien Enemies Act. Multiple courts, including the Southern District of New York, the Southern District of Texas, issued restraining orders preventing deportations. Courts cited due process clause violation as the basis. I've been through this ad nauseum, but if the due process afforded someone for criminal protections and all of that stuff is not the same thing as the due process rights someone has prior to being deported from this country. These things have been conflated, and I would say conflated intentionally so as to deceive you and me. Federal courts in Washington, D.C., and in California and in New Jersey have blocked the implementation of an executive order banning transgender individuals from military service. There's also been a federal judge in Washington that blocked the executive order on birthright citizenship. Again, I'm not saying you get into the details, these might be legitimate things, but I'm pointing out to say these are some clear-cut things that Trump has been trying to do. His political agenda, I would say this is perfectly in line. None of this is shocking or surprising, at least for those of us who have paid attention. And now courts have intervened. In the examples, I'm not going to go through and say this one, that one, not this one, all that sort of stuff, but in the examples listed and many, many others, if the courts are acting outside the bounds of their authority, if they're granting standing, or if they are implementing these these orders that prevent the executive branch from doing its constitutionally protected activity, we've got a problem on our hands. Look, I understand there's rules that this can get a little bit into the weeds, but the bottom line, without getting into the weeds, is saying in the cases where judges are acting outside the bounds of the Constitution, outside the bounds of their authority, they 100% should be subjected, my friends, to the possibility of impeachment. Now, I know, and you know, that there are going to be Democrats who will never support this. But again, make them explain why they're allowing judges to do these things. Make them defend these things. Because what'll happen is the more political pressure we can put on people to do things that are at least within the Constitution, forget even about right or wrong or according to the will of the people, the more we can expose this stuff to light, the more it's going to politically give us the numbers to be able to remedy this through the political process. So that's the first place we got to start, win or lose. I've got to take time out here, my friends. Quick time out. You're listening to Conservative Not Bitter Talk. I am your host, the one and only Todd Huff. Back in just a minute. Welcome back, my friends. So, I want to continue talking about this because this matters. This matters. These are the questions. These are the questions that I get out there. You might be wondering about. But the first thing is, what do we do with judges, or even, listen, let's just say judges for right now. What do we do with judges who are clearly trying to block Trump's constitutional authorities? They don't have the grounds to do it. They issue these things. No court remedies the situation. What do? I think the first place you got to start is impeachment. The other thing is, get these legal challenges out there early. Appeal them, move them up as high as you can, hoping that the Supreme Court will at least hear these important cases and make a ruling. Now, the individual I spoke with yesterday said, well, you can't count on the Supreme Court. Listen, I understand all of this. I understand that you won't have the votes in Congress, more than likely, to impeach these judges who are truly acting outside the bounds of the Constitution or who are acting as judicial activists. I understand that. But what's the alternative? Just to throw up our hands and say, we tried? See, we've done that for half a century. I'm amazed, and I want to get into this more later, but the left never gives up. Conservatives and Republicans oftentimes, I don't mean personally, but in the world of politics, at the first sign of trouble or at the first sign of difficulty, conservatives or Republicans often will say, well, we tried, and That's about all we're going to do about it. No, I think you have to push these things. You have to make the Supreme Court, can't make them, but get these things up to the Supreme Court. See if they'll hear the case. See if they'll make a ruling. The Supreme Court is in new territory, at least for modern times. There's all sorts of pressure to make rulings on these things. And yes, there are 6 quote-unquote conservative. I wouldn't call them conservative. By the way, I don't care if... I said this last segment. I don't care their political opinions. I care about their judicial philosophy. And if they care about what the words of the Constitution say, what the intent of the law was, if they are originalists, if you will, people who try to understand what the intention was when the law or the amendment was being made, and they try to apply that to today, then those are the people that I want on the court, if they can be unbiased. Now, unfortunately, that typically means that those people are conservative, because the judicial activists are primarily, not exclusively, but primarily the liberals on the court. And that's what the left has been banking on. I remember Mark Levin wrote a book, forget what it was called, but he wrote a book talking about how 9 men and women in long black robes can basically circumvent the will of the people. And that's not the role, I should say, of the judicial branch. It's just simply not. It's to interpret the Constitution. It's to apply the law. It's to be a spokesperson, if you will, a voice for the Constitution and the law. It's not to be a place where the left gets to have one final stop, fail-safe, I guess, some stopgap where they can have a couple of liberal justices prevent something from happening politically that should have been allowed to happen. And so that's the other option. But there's not 6, by the way. There's not 6 conservative Supreme Court justices. I count 3 reliable justices. The 3 that I think are the most reliable are Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Neil Gorsuch, who's newer, so I'm a little bit cautious, but Gorsuch seems to be on the right side regularly. Then I would put Brett Kavanaugh in a position where he's further away from that group than I would have liked him to be. Then I would put Amy Coney Barrett, and then I would put Chief Justice John Roberts. You'll notice that Amy Coney Barrett and Chief Justice John Roberts, especially Chief Justice John Roberts, often side with the 3 leftist lunatics on the Supreme Court more frequently than they should, again, for reasons that I don't think are defensible. In some cases, in other cases they are. But the bottom line here is that this is part of the process. This is part of getting the government back into its proper role, and it's not going to happen on its own. Put political pressure on the left to defend this stuff, make this an issue, talk about it, talk about the role of government, whatever you have to do. Get people to have to be playing defense and explain, defend, doing the things that they're doing. So, I mentioned earlier that the left never gives up. I want to talk about this briefly in this segment. Before I do that, though, I want to remind you, this is one of the last chances you're going to have to become a lifetime member of our Inner Circle. Inner Circle here is our membership program. There's a bunch of bonus things we're going to be doing behind the scenes, exclusive content, all that sort of stuff, video calls that I'll be on as well. You can become a member of the Inner Circle for life. This is going away. You can become a member down the road, but if you want to become a lifetime member, one-time investment, you're in for life, $99 to do that. All you have to do is go to toddhuffshow.com/join. You can get more information there, and you can become a lifetime member. toddhuffshow.com/join. Again, at toddhuffshow.com/join to secure your spot today, my friends. So I wanted to tell you that, remind you of that. That's not lasting very much longer. Okay, so the left never quits. The left never gives up. I'm reminded, I think the best example of this is when the Supreme Court declared same-sex marriage as fundamental in the Constitution. And the court made this ruling, And before that, there had been numerous referendums around the country. Same-sex marriage lost on the ballot frequently and often, and the losses piled up. It was not something that was winning politically. It just wasn't. It lost and it lost and it lost. The second that the court made the ruling that suddenly they found in the Constitution the right to marry someone of the same sex, once they did that, of course, this is the same court, by the way, many of these justices can't find anything. They find no right to keep and bear arms. They can't find that anywhere. They can't find the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in there when it comes to protecting the lives of the unborn. They can't find that. They have no idea where that stuff is, those ideas and concepts. But they can find the right to marry someone of the same sex in the Constitution. They also found the right to have an abortion in there because you have the right to privacy, whatever the world that's supposed to mean. Anyway, so this is how they operate. By the way, the Supreme Court did the right thing when they overturned the Roe versus Wade decision. It's exactly why you keep pressure on the court to remedy these things, because they have shown that they have a proclivity to make rulings, even tough rulings, as was the case when they overruled Roe. But this doesn't happen from a passive and weak administration. Fortunately, that's not what we have with the Trump administration. But bottom line here, the left lost time and time again on the issue of same-sex marriage. But the second the court ruled that same-sex marriage was in the Constitution, they lit the White House up, you'll remember, in rainbow colors when Obama was in that White House. Suddenly, same-sex marriage became the law of the land, no questions asked. Conservatives basically packed up, said, well, we tried, closed up shop for those that were trying to prevent it, and just moved on. It's a contrast between how the left operates and how the right operates. And I would say this. Look, there's not many things that I would encourage us, you and me, to emulate when it comes to the radical left. But I would say this, their desire to be to never quit, regardless of the political outcome, to never quit. I think that is actually admirable. If you want to find something, some of you say I never compliment the left, and I probably don't. But if you're looking for a compliment, I will compliment them on this and say that they never quit politically on an issue. I think we should emulate that. I do. Now, I will say that the reason they don't quit is because to them, government is God. And for many conservatives, like myself, government's not God. It's a very important thing that can control our lives, unfortunately. It determines how we live. It determines our prosperity. It determines how difficult our government is going to be, how big and intrusive it's going to be. But it's not our God. I serve a God who's risen, my friends, Christ Jesus. I don't need the government to be my God. I simply need to have fewer obstacles placed in my path. So do you. Fewer obstacles placed personally in our paths through regulation and bureaucracy, which I'll get to actually in the next segment. But it's not our God. But that is one thing, not the God part. We don't worship government, but we have to fight for these issues like the left does. Not using their same methods, I'm saying with the lack of quit in them when it comes to pursuing political victory. I've got to take a break here, my friends. Quick timeout. Back here, my friends, in just a minute. Welcome back, my friends. Third and final segment of this, the first hour of today's program. Incidentally, it is a 2-hour program, so we will continue on the other side of this break here at the end of this segment, and I welcome you to join us, which I don't know why on earth you wouldn't, but anyway, you can do that. Before I get there, though, my friends, let me remind you that every dollar that we spend is a vote for the kind of America we want to live in. That's why we launched Freedom Marketplace here at the Todd Huff Show. It's a free directory of businesses that align with your conservative principles, and values. These businesses have made a promise, no support. They will give no support to leftist candidates or leftist causes. If they break that promise, they're booted from the directory. My friends, they're out. So if you're tired of funding the woke agenda, if you're tired of your money going to causes, support causes that you personally fight against on the regular basis, my friends, check out freedommarketplace.net. It is free for you. It is easy. Liberty and business for all, my friends, at freedommarketplace.net. All right, so I talked about this in today's Todd Talk, which you can find on our website under, you guessed it, Todd Talk. But there was a poll conducted by RMG Research. I find this quite insightful and quite relevant to the political discussions of the day here. There was a question in this survey. Surveyed bureaucrats in working in the. Well, I don't know if it was just they were bureaucrats that worked in government. I don't know if it was just federal or if it was also state. But here's the question. Imagine that you were the head of a federal government agency. Suppose that President Trump gave you an order, this is the important part, that was legal, but you believed it was bad policy. Would you follow the president's order or do what you thought best? Now, the correct answer we all know. We may not want to admit it when our guy isn't in office, but the correct thing to do is to follow the legal order. The bureaucratic state, the federal government, 100%, the bureaucracy, works at the pleasure and direction of the President of the United States. All of these things fall under the executive branch, and all of the things in the executive branch are under the authority of the President of the United States. Congress, they don't report to Congress. They might report to Congress through Congress's oversight, but they're headed by, they report directly to, meaning for their role and responsibility and so forth, to the President of the United States. Now listen to this. Listen to the responses. Only 17% of Democratic managers who voted for Harris said they would follow Trump's order, while 3 times as many, 64%, say they would ignore it. This amounts to a declaration. This, by the way, is at thedailysignal.com if I didn't say that. This amounts to a declaration that they plan to act like a deep state, opposing the people's elected president. By the way, this is 100% proof. This is proof positive that there is such a thing as the deep state. The deep state simply, it's funny. I get comments about this stuff sometimes. People, when you use the word deep state, they roll their eyes, and that's fine. It doesn't bother me. But at least know what you're rolling your eyes about here. Actually, I'm gonna read. I've done this maybe one other time. So I'm going to read the Todd Talk to hit this point home because I don't have much time left. My friends, call it what you will, but there is absolutely positively a deep state operating within the shadows of our federal bureaucracy. The deep state refers to unelected bureaucrats who pursue their own agendas, ignoring the legal and constitutional directives of the administration in power. These are rogue, unelected actors who operate outside the will of the people. Case in point, a recent RMG research survey, which I'm just referencing here, by the way, found 3 out of 4 federal managers who voted for Kamala Harris would not follow a legal order from President Trump if they disagreed with the policy. These are not bureaucrats, they're deep state agents. If those claiming to save our democracy were serious, shouldn't they start by rooting out those sabotaging it? That would be the great starting point, right? That would be the correct starting point. If you were really interested in saving our democracy, you would be interested in eradicating from our government those parts, those actions that were sabotaging the way that it was supposed to work in our government. That's what you would think these folks who get on their soapboxes and talk about saving our democracy would be doing. But they're not interested in that because, again, just as we were talking about previously with rogue, unaccountable judges who do what they want, how they want to do it, even if it's outside their authority through judicial activism, just as that's the case, it's also the case that you can have people within the bureaucratic state that are simply refusing to follow the orders, the lawful constitutional orders of the president. This is proof positive that there is a deep state. This is precisely what people mean when they talk about the deep state, operating outside the will of the elected representative of the administrative branch, the executive branch, which is now President Trump. And I've got to go. Out of time this hour. STG.